Morning everyone, and a very warm welcome to this Conservative Home event, Great Green Britain, how winning the net zero technology race will boost prosperity, hosted in partnership with EnergyUK. I'm Charlotte Gill, Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, and today I'll be chairing a panel discussion on the government's net zero ambitions. We'll be looking at what opportunities net zero offers for the UK, from new technologies to job creation. We'll be exploring what business and government can do to maximise these opportunities and ensure that British workers and communities feel the benefits. And we'll be looking at the role of policy innovation in creating Great Green Britain. And with me to discuss this topic, I'm delighted to be joined by Greg Hands, MP and Minister of State for Energy, Clean Growth and Climate Change, Emma Pinchbeck, Chief Executive of EnergyUK, Alexander Stafford MP and Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Environmental, Social and Governance, and Rachel Wolfe is joining us in a bit. She's running a little bit late, but she'll be along, and she's founding partner of Public First and co-author of the 2019 Conservative Manifesto. So thank you so much everyone for joining today and to our panel. To start off with, I'm going to ask the panel to speak for 5 minutes on their thoughts of today's topic. And then we'll get some questions going. Do you have a think while you're listening about what you'd like to ask? And I'd like to open the floor and get a really good debate going today. Greg, please kick off.
Well, thank you, Charlotte, and morning conference. Right, well, this is a massive topic. So where do we get started? I think the best way to start it is by stating that technology has already massively enhanced and made possible our move to net zero, our drive to net zero. And I think it's probably no coincidence that the UK, we are the best in the G20 for emissions reductions, but also probably the second best in the G20 for tech overall. And I think the coincidence there is not a coincidence. I think the ability to drive technological change in this space is something which the UK has naturally adapted to. As a government, as you know, we've got very ambitious targets on research and development to raise that significantly as a percentage of, or part of our GDP. This year we're investing £14.9 billion in R&D, puts it at the highest level in 4 decades. We're committed to increase that to 22 billion and drive to 2.4% of GDP by 2027. So overall, our R&D picture, the background here, is usefully coincident in timing with our move to net zero. Let me look at a few things in practice, how tech has driven that change. When I was Chief Secretary of the Treasury 2015, at the time of the decisive move towards offshore wind, which has been one of the UK's massive energy success stories of the last 5 or 6 years. We now have the world's largest installed offshore wind capacity. As the Prime Minister puts it, we are the Saudi Arabia of wind. And a large part of that has been due to the driving down of costs in the sector. Part of that is due to scaling up, but also part of that is due to better use of technology and making sure that technology gets through to how we're actually installing our offshore wind capability. So the costs for offshore wind have declined by 2/3 since 2015, largely driven by technology. We're looking to quadruple that capacity by that generation by the year 2040, and so a lot of that is driven already by our technology. And I think I've been in this job for 3 weeks, but I managed to squeeze in amongst all the, shall we say, the more short-term issues that have been going on in the portfolio in the last 3 weeks. But I have managed to squeeze in a visit to Hartlepool and Blythe the last week. And it just struck me how the current green industrial revolution is very much located in areas that were so prominent in our first industrial revolution. And so in Blythe, for example, the site of what used to be Britain's, I think, largest or certainly most efficient or most prominent coal-fired power station, there are 2 of them right there in Blythe, right next to each other. That site, it closed in, I think, about the year 2000, demolished shortly after, is now the site of a £130 million investment in offshore wind cabling. So literally on the site where, if you like, the most prominent part of our coal history and our coal-fired power production is today being devoted to offshore wind. And so much of that is driven by technology. The Prime Minister's 10-point plan I already referred to. Point 10, the vision for the UK to be a global leader in technology to decarbonise our economy. That will also be feeding through into our net zero strategy to be published later this month as well. So that vision is set out very clearly. The 10-point plan also includes our flagship £1 billion net zero innovation portfolio for 2021, which will accelerate the commercialisation of innovative low-carbon technologies, systems and business models in power, buildings and industry. And we've actually doubled the size of the energy innovation programme from the last Parliament, which did some amazing things. That Energy Innovation Fund led to the UK's first carbon capture and use plant in Cheshire, a new CCUS international testing centre in Sheffield, a bioenergy with carbon capture and storage pilot in Yorkshire, the world's largest offshore wind turbine blade in Northumberland. So these are like massive technology and innovation steps forward. We're also, of course, in terms of our energy policy overall, which we're looking to keep the lid on bills, we're looking to diversify, we're looking to have security of supply. Technology is going to be a key part of that, particularly on the diversification, how we drive through technology and small modular reactors on the nuclear side, on hydrogen, carbon capture, usage and storage. A lot of this is technology we already know about, but actually developing further. And as I will say, I think, Charlotte, I think the heading for net zero does not mean closing down the economy. When you look at our success, relative success as a country in the last 30 years, I know we've got a lot further to go, but our relative success in the last 30 years in growing the economy by 78% in that last 30 years, reducing our emissions by 44% at the same time, shows that we have the ability to grow, to innovate, whilst at the same time moving to net zero. So we've shown with offshore wind, we've shown with electric vehicles and a lot of other technologies that we can bring down the costs of the transformation and the move to net zero, particularly using the UK's incredible technology base. So I would say, finish on an optimistic note, as we go forward to COP and as we drive towards net zero by 2050, obviously technology in the UK, technological capability, is going to be a massive part of it.
Thank you, Greg. And Emma.
I mean, this is going to look like we just coordinated our notes beforehand, or all of you get to hear the same messages twice. So it's been about 13 years since we passed the Climate Change Act, and I represent the energy sector, and that includes the retailers, the generators, and also the other bits in the system, things like EV charging installers and all of the interesting technologies coming through on the demand side. So it's a big brief. But the energy sector has so far been massively successful in decarbonisation. Most of our emissions reduction has come from the change in the power sector, and we're down about 70% on 1990 levels already. The energy sector is also massive, so the fact that we've been able to do that at scale, I think, is impressive. We still employ 780,000 people across the country, and so we've gone through this transition whilst maintaining those jobs and investing in new ones. What I would say to you in my pitch is that, and actually the reason I'm in this job as a decarbonisation specialist, is it has long since moved from being something which is driven by the need to mitigate our emissions as much as the industry's up for that moral mission. Instead, this is about a massive industrial revolution driven by new kinds of technology. And so there's an element of decarbonisation that will be taken care of simply because these technologies are better. And they're better for the whole economy, but they're also better for customers. So just to give you some examples and to pick up on things that Greg said, renewables are now the cheapest form of generation, bar none. That means the whole of the industry is rapidly moving its investment into renewables and technologies that complement them. And they're fundamentally different kinds of technologies. They're very flexible assets. This means we'll have lots of cheap green electrons coming through. And so we're therefore looking at flexible technologies that complement those renewables, things like EVs, things like batteries. And so the energy system is moving from one dominated by molecules to one that will be dominated by electrons, with hydrogen and other technologies filling in the gaps, nuclear too. This change was driven by originally the Climate Change Act, but then a really smart public-private partnership where we invested in R&D. But then we took the technologies through to scale through market instruments, things like our contract for difference auction. And that's become a world-leading process which other countries are now seeking to replicate. And as Greg said, a lot of the cost savings that came through that market mechanism were driven not just by technology improvements, but the use of technologies to drive operations and maintenance improvements. And this is incredibly boring, sorry, but I've been up to see a lot of these sites in Blyth and Hull and Grimsby. And what's really smart is the industry's recycled skills from other industries and repurposed them for renewables. So the reason we're in those places is that we've got skills like fishing fleets that we can repurpose to do O&M out on the renewables fleets. We've got skilled engineers in those places. We've got a history of industrialisation in those places. But also we've then partnered with new technologies. So one of the reasons that we're getting very good at building offshore wind is that we're very good at getting out to the fleet when the weather is good, which we've done partly because we use really good big data from satellites now. So there's a kind of blend of old world and new world happening, which is driven down costs and has been driven by technology in as much as policy. So that's big picture, the big system, the energy system as we all imagine it. I just want to say something about the well-trailed announcement about decarbonising the power sector by 2035, and to say it's remarkable now that the energy sector is up for that kind of challenge. We are very up for that kind of challenge in the energy industry. Where and how fast we go in the 2030s does now depend on replicating what we've done so well for offshore wind with the technologies we need. So we know we need market mechanisms for things like carbon capture and hydrogen. We probably need, 1-2 new nuclear power stations coming forward. We need to double or triple the size of our power sector to accomplish this electrified system. We need market mechanisms that recognise the value of flexible renewables. We need all of the storage technologies and EVs and charging and stuff to come online too. So it's a big challenge for government. Greg, you've been in the job 3 weeks, so I'll just add to your to-do list later, but it's a massive brief. We also need some non-market changes, things like our planning, consenting process, really slow-moving regulatory processes to shift so that we can go much, much faster. But in principle, if those things change, industry can move, and we've seen that we can go faster than we often think, so long as the market's there. So this is my pitch. I quite like an energy bill, please. We'd like one as soon as possible, and we'd like it to be fairly comprehensive and recognise the moment. Greg rightly mentioned that it's been a tricky time for retail at the moment. You've all been watching the news, but I just want to put a plug in for the consumer end of technology. And again, another reason I took the job. The power sector, in as much as I've just listed a lot of things that make it complicated, is relatively straightforward because of the kind of economic weight behind electrification and new technologies and this change. Heat and transport systems are a really big challenge for decarbonisation, but again, we can expect a technology revolution there. We've got smart, digitalised technologies coming forward. We've got heat pumps that I'm very confident the costs will fall and come forward. We've got, I went to a panel event last night where we were talking about recycling waste into heating systems in industrial areas. We've got hydrogen. There are all of these new technologies coming. And the really important thing there is to recognise that fundamentally this will change people's relationship with energy, and that's a really good thing. So all of you sitting here currently pay for a fairly dumb commodity to come through your plug. By the time we're in the 2030s, you should be able to use your house, maybe the 2040s, as a little mini power station. You might have an EV in your driveway, you might have a heat pump, you might be part of a heat network. All of these things will fundamentally change your relationship with energy, so you'll be buying a service rather than a commodity, and I think that's hugely exciting for building people's relationships with their energy use. It's also why the retailers are really important and why we need a sustainable retail industry that can do some of this innovation. And lastly, because I have no idea how long I've talked for, but it's probably too long, I heard the Chancellor speak last night at an event, and he said rightly, if you stand in the Midland and you look out over at Manchester, you can see the old industrial revolution having happened, this incredible skyline that was built as a partnership between industry, by industrialists, working off the back of government policy 150 years ago. But the thing that he missed there is that underpinning that huge change was an energy revolution. It was the steam engine and the industrial revolution that helped power that economy. And my pitch to government at the moment is this isn't just about climate change. Genuinely, where I sit in my job, this is a technology revolution that is coming for all of us. It will fundamentally change the economy and some of the values that go into it. And there is therefore an opportunity for the UK to really lead it, but that is a cross-government, cross-economy change. It's not just an energy sector change. So we would really love to see things like a net zero test in our fiscal policy, and we would really love to see some thinking about the institutional governance that we need to get it done, both in Whitehall and at regional level. And the reason that's important is that this is about capturing a new industrial revolution as well as delivering on our climate change agreement. Okay.
Thank you, Emma. And welcome to Rachel. So Alex.
Thank you very much. We've got to talk about the big picture here. First of all, I'm sorry, my voice is a horse. It was a fun night last night, right? The whole world is going low carbon, whether we like it or not. We are going to get low carbon across the world. Some countries will be quicker, some countries will be slower, but the whole world is going low carbon. We don't have all the solutions, though, to get to low carbon. We don't know how to decarbonise transport fully. We don't know how to drive HGVs, planes, ships. We don't know properly how to decarbonise, or the correct solution to decarbonise home heatings. We don't know how to decarbonise so much of it. But we all know we are going to get to that journey. And the only way we can get to low carbon, or net carbon zero, is by technology. Now my pitch, Emma's pitch to the government, is if we get there first and fastest and develop those technologies here in the UK, we can make a lot of money and create a lot of jobs and a lot of wealth. I talk a lot about climate change about groups I do in Parliament, but when I speak to my constituents in Rother Valley, the first time a Conservative has ever represented the people of Rother Valley, I don't talk to them about climate change. I don't talk about electrons coming out of their plugs. I don't talk to them about any of this stuff because it's boring. It's irrelevant to people's lives. What I talk about is jobs. Say, there are new jobs coming, there's new technologies, there's new wealth coming. And if we harness it, if the government harnesses it, you get there first, faster and quickest, you in Rother Valley can benefit from this. Because we've lost some of the battles already. If you look around, we're talking about EVs, great technology of the future. We'll be driving, our passenger transport will be driving EVs in not that distant, long in the future. We've lost the battle. China makes 73% of lithium-ion battles. China is making the money from EVs. Yes, we'll have small increases for the economy from developing EVs in the country, but the big fundamental pots of money and jobs are not going to be created from EVs in the UK because we missed that boat. But I'm also very optimistic because I mentioned there's still lots of the technology, the low carbon technology, which haven't been developed yet, not fully, and that the UK is in the driving seat for. Hydrogen is one I do talk about, and yes, I know hydrogen can be controversial to quite a lot of people, and I don't believe it is the ultimate solution to all of transport. But for things like HGVs, for marine and aviation, that's probably the only game in town. Even for home heating, it's probably one of the better games in town. Yes, we've got heat pumps, but that won't be for everyone, and they're still going to be very expensive. Costs will come down. But we are very lucky with our current gas network that we could upskill it or change it quite quickly to have a 20% mix in the pipes. So if we do this first, we can then sell that technology, sell that, whether it's the physical technology, whether it's IP, abroad, and we can make money. Hydrogen batteries. A third of all hydrogen engines across the world have components made in the UK. We are already leading the way on hydrogen. We're slightly slipping down now, but we can do it and we can go further and we can go faster. The Minister's already talked about wind technology. We are a world leader in offshore wind technology. The more we develop that, the more we can sell that technology, sell the experience abroad. We can make more money. We can create jobs. Same with small modular reactors. We are leading. Rolls-Royce is leading the charge on that. Once again, it slipped back the last few years. But if you harness it, we can use that again. The Minister has talked about areas like mine, former Red Wall seats, where we can have the jobs. The government loves talking about building back better and rebounding after COVID, which is essential. But we can only do that if you create new jobs. And we can't just tinker around the edge and create jobs that the industry's already got. We need a whole-scale green industrial revolution where those jobs are developed in seats like mine. I talk about in Parliament Rother Valley being a hydrogen valley because I think we have that technology which could create the jobs and the wealth for Britain. But I also want to say why we need to win the technology battle in a more slightly negative way as well. Because if we don't, other countries will win. And fundamentally, some of those countries in the driving seat are not our friends, and they're not our allies. I mentioned China already, but I think we should dwell on China. The majority of the critical minerals, which are needed to power the batteries, needed for this technology, are processed in China. The majority of the mines and where they're developed from are controlled by proxy, in Africa especially, are controlled by proxy Chinese companies. We know we cannot trust China. During last year, during COVID, I'm sure you know the PPE sort of issues at the start, China did not fulfill their contractual agreements to us. China sent us poor quality equipment. When the going got tough on PPE, China looked to itself. When the going gets tough when it comes to renewable technology, and when we're in this race for critical minerals, we cannot rely on countries like China. We need to develop our own homegrown manufacturing of critical minerals. And yes, we can't necessarily mine much. We have got lithium deposits in the UK, and we've got gold and nickel and stuff, but it's relatively small. What we can do in the UK is have the technologies to process the minerals. At the moment, so much of Australia, very known for its mining, mines a lot of critical minerals. But the majority of critical minerals mined in Australia are then sent to China for processing and then sent back to Australia. That is madness. We in the UK should develop with our international, with former trade minister, those links with countries like Australia, critical minerals strategy jointly, so that we can have the minerals mined in Australia, sent to the UK to Rother Valley for processing, and then we can export it back. We can have that whole system, which not only will funnel this green revolution, the technology will give us the jobs, but also increase our own security. Because there is going to be a race for critical minerals and renewables, and we need to protect what we have. And we can't be a hock to countries, frankly, we can't trust. So Minister, there's lots of job potential, there's lots of wealth potential, but we need to do more and do faster. We need to work better with our natural allies to make sure we have an unlimited supply of them when we need them.
Thank you, Alexander. And Rachel.
Thank you, and apologies for being late. I was running from another panel. I'm just going to make a couple of points before we open up to questions. Whenever I think, particularly in Manchester, about this question of net zero, I always go back to Malthus and this prediction in the 19th century that population growth was going to lead to this catastrophic era of starvation and death and fights between countries. And Malthus's prediction did not come true because of the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution happened because we discovered how to harness vastly more energy than we thought we would before. And it has propelled Britain, which was one of the first mover, which is why Manchester looks like it does, and the world to prosperity that we would have thought was unimaginable 2 centuries ago. And the reason I start with this is because I do think we need to recognise that obviously if prosperity was our only aim, we would not start by rewiring the entirety of the energy system in order to gain jobs. The reason we are doing it is twofold. The first is because we think the downside consequences of not doing it will be catastrophic for the country, for the world, and in prosperity terms and in other terms. And second, as Alexander said, because once states decide to shift their economies to net zero and start to put vast amounts of public money into it, as well as private money starting to go into it, some people will gain more than others, and we gain very much from the first industrial revolution, and the question is, will we gain from the second? And I think this is a massive challenge for the UK, because traditionally it is not actually how governments, and certainly not how Conservative governments, have thought about the economy. We've generally been governments that have relied on basic labour market conditions, low regulation, relatively low tax, increasingly relatively low tax, but have actually been quite uncomfortable with going the full hog of the kind of industrial strategy that other countries are more practiced at, put more money into and more attention into, and which we have always felt this real tension between, can we do it well? Does it involve picking winners? Is it somehow almost corrupt to have this kind of close interaction between industry and government? And that clearly has to change if we are serious about gaining some of the technological gains and the job gains from the net zero shift. And I think we've seen parts of it. I think the 10-point plan does identify where we think some of our relative strengths are, although they are in places very similar to where other countries also think their relative strengths are, and starts to look at the really serious investments that are needed. But I think the risk for the UK, and then I will stop, is that we often do this very half-heartedly. So we do things like catapults a bit, but not nearly as much as Germany does the equivalent. We talk about gigafactories quite a lot, but don't actually put the investment that means the gigafactories are going to arrive. We try and pick every sector somewhat because we're very frightened of making choices. And that makes sense to be relatively hands-off. In a lot of cases, I think it's done the UK well. It's completely impossible, I think, as we're moving to the net zero revolution. So that is a long-winded way of saying I think we're going to have to make some very clear choices, and we're going to have to properly back the choices we make rather than being sort of midway between them all. I think one area then also that I will flag, and apologies if it's come up before, but I haven't heard it yet, where I think we have manifestly global strength, but remain quite weak at deploying it, is in the R&D sector. We have a lot of universities which are the very top in the world. We have many of the best climate scientists in the world. We do not begin yet to use the increased R&D funding that is, we hope, coming down the track to link that strength to exactly the kind of jobs that Alexander was talking about. And I think if we wire those intelligently, we do have the ability to both create real R&D clusters that develop technology that will benefit us in the world and also create jobs. I would just say that in my experience, we have yet to go the full hog yet, and it is going to require quite a big change in how we think about government, and a change that's quite uncomfortable, I think, often for the Conservative Party. I'll stop there. I'm conscious I was late and I don't want to take too long, but...
Thank you, Rachel. Let's pick up a bit on what Rachel was saying about the government being a bit half-hearted about picking winners in terms of industries and technologies. How do you think the government could make more clear-cut choices in this regard? What do you think about that?
Well, I'm not sure I yes agree with Rachel on that analysis. But to be frank, I've been doing this brief for 3 weeks, so it would be churlish of me to come to an early judgment on that. But I do think, when Rachel talks about making choices, I think we have to get, if you like, a balance. I would prefer to approach things more like a portfolio. There's always a possibility of making a wrong choice. But if you diversify the choices that you make, the impact of making a wrong choice within that portfolio is then diminished. So I would actually point us perhaps slightly further, and Rachel may not be talking across purposes. I point us slightly further in actually investing in a diversity of whether it be energy sources. Actually, people said, as it Rishi said, the reason Manchester looks like it is because of the Industrial Revolution. I think it's actually just because of the rain, really. That's the reason Manchester looks like it is. But look, I would say R&D, there is a big boost. And the UK has not been at the forefront of R&D as a percentage of GDP for some time. As I mentioned, our R&D as a percentage of GDP, like a crude figure we're putting into it, is the highest it's been for 4 decades. £14.9 billion this year, which is outstripped quite a few other government budgets within that. So we need to make sure that R&D obviously goes into the right places. George Freeman, the new Science and Innovation Minister, has definitely got at the top of his inbox making sure that that money gets better through UK RI, which is an organisation I'm not as familiar with as I should be. But George is very much gripping that and is going to make sure that it gets through better to the front line and actually becomes stuff that we can really use, which I think Rachel and I would very much agree on that the kind of our universities, world-leading universities, we need to just make sure a bit better that their capability feeds through into innovation and stuff we can actually use.
And if I just jump in on that as well, I don't think it's about picking the winners. I think if you learn many things from COVID, one thing the government got incredibly right is the vaccine. I think from outside looking at it, the reason why we got the vaccine right is because the government backed a whole myriad of vaccines, realising some won't work, realising we would waste money backing some vaccines that wouldn't come to market, but also realising because we backed enough, we would benefit. And we did.
I'm going to come back on this because I think all panels are more interesting when people disagree. I think that's completely true, but only if you back each of your diversified bids to the hilt.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah, and on that, so what we need the government to do, and the public as well, to realise is that we're going to waste money. We're going to back technologies that are going to fail, and the public has to realise we're going to spend tens of billions of pounds on technology that won't work or be effective, because we'll also be spending tens of billions of pounds on technology that will work, which will get the jobs. And we both need the government, but also the public to understand it's okay that we don't count every bean, because in the bigger picture, we're going to get economic benefits.
But let's all just have a fight. Why not? So there's a live example of where we went wrong and went right. God, that's poor grammar. It's day 3, isn't it? And that's with offshore wind, right? So outside of my work with EnergyUK, I do some work with InnovateUK and some of the research institutes. And what we know now from wind is this: we had some of the earliest wind turbine designs in the world in the UK. We had some of the best research on on what wind could do. And the government at the time was quite sceptical of it being a dominant resource. And, admittedly I'm biased because I work for the renewables industry, but the renewables industry was screaming that they thought they could scale these technologies up and that costs would fall. But it would take backing them to the hilt early. And we did the R&D phase, but then there's this thing called technology readiness phases. But basically the next 3 or so phases of technology development happened in Europe because we just weren't ready to take the risk in the UK. And then what happens if you do that is you may eventually get a cheap technology. So we picked the technology up further down the curve. We brought in the CFD and FIDR contracts, and we now have a very cheap wind resource, a fantastic wind fleet that's in development, and a wind industry in the UK. But we're having to put the industrial benefits of that in as the second phase of wind development, whereas the Scandinavians who took the early punt had the factories from the beginning. So I had almost zero tolerance when I used to get questions from government about why the wind industry in the UK wasn't more based here 5 to 10 years ago, and the reason was that we didn't take the punt early enough. And then on technology mixes and throwing billions of quid down the drain. Not the line we're going for, Alex, but
We've got to be realistic.
I think actually most of the technologies are here. We can see pretty clearly in industry how they will develop. It's not actually as risky a punt as we think, partly because the other benefit that the UK has is climate scientists and engineers and researchers who've mapped out a pretty clear trajectory and taken pretty good estimates using our experience with things like renewables. So yes, there'll be some capital at risk, but A, that's industry's job, give us the markets, and B, it's less risky than you think. And lastly, on the technology mix, here's the most complicated thing about the UK energy system. In a nutshell, we have a giant offshore wind fleet, and we have nuclear power and big transmission connected generation, big kit. We also have huge potential to innovate on what we call the demand side in energy, so with houses and vehicles and the energy demand side and distributed and interesting technologies that are called, this is the hand motion for that bit of the system, and then big stuff on the other end. And actually we need to do a little bit of everything and back it to the hilt, because actually in this system we probably do need a huge range of technologies to get there, and that's partly because of our particular characteristics in terms of our energy generation potential. It's partly because of the skills we have in the country and our own aptitude for technology development, and it's also because of the kind of economy we have. So in the UK we need all of the above. Great. How you design a market that can do both this whizzy demand side interesting stuff that's distributed and consumer and demand side led, and you do big kit, big investment, institutional investors, that kind of market too, that 50-50 system is the real challenge, and that's what I think policymakers need to really grapple with.
And we also go back to what I was saying, like, we know some technologies which we're going to have to use. Go back to hydrogen. We're not going to have massive amounts of electric vehicles in Russia. We're not going to have massive amounts of electric vehicles in South America or large parts of Africa. We know we can develop that technology, and then we can sell that technology abroad. So I very much think the government should be looking at what can we do in the UK, what can we develop in the UK then to sell abroad that technology, and that has to be key to everything. We can't just look at the UK side of things, we have to look at what our potential future exports should be.
Yeah.
So we're hearing. So it's great to hear such a positive vision of net zero, and clearly it's going to have loads of economic benefits, even if we do waste a lot of money, as Alex said. But I just wondered, how are we going to?
It's not a waste, it's investment. Not all investment will succeed.
How are we going to convey that? Because a lot of the headlines about net zero, I would say, are pretty negative at the moment. You're going to have to tear out your gas boiler, or about the cost. And I think there's a lot of public anxiety bubbling under the surface. So I'm going to ask, has the government messaging been strong enough in regards to conveying the opportunities? Is Build Back Better the right slogan, or some of the slogans that they've been using? What do you think, Greg?
Well, I disagree. Actually, I think public opinion is for want of a better term, warming on net zero. Right the way across the country, I think support for moving to net zero has grown, particularly in the last year or two. The figure I think of most recently was 76% of people were either very concerned or rather concerned about climate change, and therefore supportive of a move to net zero. So I think that support is pretty high. Build Back Better, well, the strapline often beneath it is Build Back Greener, and certainly the Prime Minister very strongly believes that, and that comes through very strongly in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan, which, by the way, I'm hoping everybody in the room will have read this, but it is a very easy, digestible read. I'm not just saying that because I became the minister 3 weeks ago, but it is actually a very, very good sort of retail document. So if you've got stakeholders, or you're not particularly interested or involved in energy, or in this case, for constituents, if you're a member of Parliament, send them this. I think this actually outlines pretty well the direction of travel. I think we'll see how COP goes in terms of the public consciousness. I think the British people will see the UK being a leader in this space. Obviously, there'll be people saying we should be going faster, there'll be people saying we should be going slower, there'll be people saying we should be doing it in a different way, but I think the actual consensus out there amongst the general population across the country is broadly supportive of what the UK is doing, and the UK leading the way and actually trying to get the rest of the world to follow us. I think Alex's point about exporting capability, I was the Minister for Exports not so long ago, and actually exporting our offshore wind capability is very much part of that future. So I've been talking in Korea, in Taiwan, and Vietnam, countries which have got good natural geography for offshore wind, and trying to sell in the UK capability for some of those countries, I think is going to be really, really important going forward, because that is also how we're going to help pay back our investment, is actually selling the capability as well. But broadly, I think, I think the public is very broadly supportive. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a complete sort of multi-flex support. I think there will be limits, and I think there is a certain concern about cost. But the more we can use what we're talking about today, technology, and the more we can use scaling up, exactly the sort of things that we've done with offshore wind or with nuclear power. It's very expensive to build one nuclear power station. It becomes less expensive to build 2 or 3 nuclear power stations. So the more we can kind of scale up, I think, some of this, I think will keep the cost down, while still keeping in place a lot of the retail offer we have, like the energy price cap and all of the different support mechanisms in place for those who are struggling to pay their bills. So I think that combination of approach. But broadly speaking, I think the British public are supportive of this.
I think so. I'm going to give the government some real credit, and at the risk of my own career, raise what's been going on in the media the last few weeks. And clearly it's been a tough time for ordinary people and for bits of the energy industry. But I have been really, I mean, it's not my first time at this particular radio and talking about energy in the media, and I've been really struck that actually already the narrative is straight to not just the short term, what can we do to look after vulnerable people through this, but what are the system and institutional changes we need to stop this happening again. And I've been really impressed that the government has taken the opportunity to say, this is the reason that we're pursuing a net zero strategy. So talking, because, international volatile gas prices are a big contributor to what's going on with ordinary people's bills. And I think it's really striking to see other benefits being talked about for pursuing what is basically a climate change strategy. And I think that's a good thing for government to be doing, as well as focusing on what they're doing in the short term. So just to give the government some credit, keep doing that.
Thank you.
I think the second thing, though, is, and I absolutely agree, all of the polling bears this out, the British public have always been worried about climate change. The figures have never dipped below 70 or 80% support for climate change action, regardless of what you see in bits of the press. I think that's increasing as we see, frankly, quite weird weather beginning to bite. I think we've all seen the impacts this year, so we're seeing spikes in concern because it's literally happening. You just need to look out of your window and realise it's a problem. And I think the penny's dropping for a lot of people that this is as good as it gets. Like, the battle now is to stop it getting any worse than this. And that is a difficult thing for the public to wake up to, appreciate, realise. And you're seeing that anxiety playing out now. The gap, and the bit we haven't talked about, is when you do the polling on the changes, that's where it often falls down. So Alex and I worked together at WWF a long time ago, and I will tell you that people always wanted to talk to us about diets and planes, and very rarely wanted to talk to us about boilers and cars. And people often don't understand where emissions come from in the economy, and so then it feels like a surprise when you're told you might have to change your heating system. And the other thing is, I think generally we need to make this about the benefits and a proper dialogue with people, so done for people, not to people. And there are two aspects to that. One is my job, our job in the energy industry. I see some of you in the room. I took the job at EnergyUK because we have energy retailers as well as generators. So we have the people who sell the products as well as the people who build the system. And that's critical because the energy retailers have conversations with all of you every day, maybe not every day, often, about your own energy use. They're going to be putting these technologies into homes, and they have a vested interest in making sure that you have these products because they can sell you more services. So I'm really, really excited with a few regulatory changes, like moving levies off electricity bills, to see if the energy retailers can make some of these technologies attractive, sexy, interesting for particularly the able-to-pay market. Because that would change the conversation. The second thing, which is government's job, is the Climate Assembly was a massive success. And it was a massive success because what happened was we took ordinary members of the public through the science in detail. It was a really good communications effort. And what was striking about it is the public were more rigorous than government thought was possible about the measures they recommended after that conversation had been had, which surprised, I think, even those of us in the environmental movement. So the public were like, put a tax on frequent flyers, bring forward an EV target, very kind of like ban things and go further than government was willing to once they understood what the options were. I wonder whether there is a job for government when we're launching some of these policies to invest properly in communication as well, because we've seen that it works. So there's a bit of this that's for industry to make it interesting and appealing and sexy. There's a bit for government, particularly if we are taking regulatory measures to say to people, this is what it's for, and to really do that communications piece too.
Can I ask you, when you say take the levies off electricity bills, where would you put them, on general taxation?
This is an unfair question. So the sector had split views about it. Everyone's united in the idea that they should come off electricity bills. So for those of you who are not really spectacularly nerdy about energy, congratulations. But essentially 20% of the current electricity bill is made up of policy costs, and we chose to put them on electricity for what felt like a very good idea at the time, which was a lot of the levies were funding clean electricity generation. As we move to decarbonise heat, we're now in a situation where probably, and not all, Alex, but a very significant portion of our heat will need to be electrified because of the way the energy system works, and because it should be very cheap for people and very interesting. But it's very difficult to get a commercial proposition for that away at the moment because the costs of electricity are artificially high against gas. There's no carbon price on gas across the whole economy, firstly. But secondly, there are levies on the electricity bill. So the simplest way to even that up is to move the levies off electricity bills. There are different, and Rachel has a paper on this, there are different ways you can do that. You can put it into general taxation. You could put it into something like the ETS, which I know the Treasury was talking about, or you could simply move the levies from electricity to gas. If I'm being, and this is a recognition of the current politics, I think it would be quite difficult to put anything onto gas at the moment for ordinary consumers. So the energy industry now collectively thinks, put it somewhere else in the economy. By the way, if that's unpleasant for the Treasury to pitch, you can do it. There are ways of doing it where you can kind of transition that in so that the costs through taxation come in slowly. But you can fairly immediately do the change on the electricity bill. So we can talk about this afterwards. But that single change would enable us to see if we can get a commercial proposition for heat pumps away and drive down the costs. And I know one of the retailers, Octopus, has been at conference talking about this, but there are 5 energy retailers who all want to do this kind of initiative, targeting different bits of the market with different scale-up propositions. The key message is that we expect costs to fall, but they are united in wanting that change. Plus, grants possibly and other changes in regs, but that levies change is critical.
Rachel, did you want to come back to those points?
I'll be brief because I'm conscious you'll want to get to questions. So very quickly, what I would do is I would remove the levies off electricity. I give people a break over the winter, and when it gets warmer, I put on a carbon price across electricity and gas, is what I would do. But I think on the more general point, so I actually think the government's got the messaging on this pretty much right. I don't think the government has a messaging problem right now. I think it has a policy and delivery problem. Yep. And we're waiting for a lot of policy to emerge in the next couple of months. But to give 2 examples, people are very keen on the green jobs messaging. They will at some point notice whether they're employed or not and in what. So the jobs actually have to appear, which is what I mean by the delivery being the kind of core issue rather than messaging. There are, I think, 2 big, and even on heat pumps, we did some opinion research on this recently, given that you don't actually need everybody to switch their boiler next year, this is not impossible with the right incentives. I think there are 2 big downside sort of risks on net zero. One is cost, but this is kind of pretty obvious how you manage it through policy if you're willing to. The second, which is why I think actually COP is a bit of a risk, is the kind of why are we doing this when others aren't, and in particular when China isn't argument. And that is the one that I consistently find is most effective in the focus groups and polling we do. And I think the potential for COP is to show countries are all moving towards this. The risk of COP is if some of the very, very big emitters don't. And there are also some, I think, surface risks, whether it's fair or not. People don't love the image of lots of people flying on planes to a climate conference. They get quite irritated if people who they think earn much more of them are not making the switches that they are being asked to make. So there are some kind of image issues. But fundamentally, and I'm conscious this is very tough for the minister, not only because he's new to the job, but because we're all waiting for quite a lot of strategies to emerge and he can't say what's in them. The next step has to be about policy and delivery. It's not a communications challenge fundamentally.
Yeah. What I've seen to put my personal anecdote in is because I did some research recently for the Telegraph, interviewing people in my area about how they were finding some environmental policies, and I guess it is actually a Labour-run borough where I'm living, so it's not technically government policy, but the thing they were most upset about was changing their vehicles multiple times because of the ultra low emission zones. They felt they were kind of quite sad about it, like mourning the vehicle, and they felt like they hadn't really had a choice. And then they were also very upset about low traffic neighbourhoods. They were so cross. I felt like an agony aunt, talking to people.
And I think that this is one of the problems you've got sometimes with the whole messaging across the sector. It's often say we have to put low traffic neighbourhoods in, so those who don't know, blocking roads. Well, actually, does it matter whether you have a car if your car is an electric vehicle? We don't need to have that whole scale change. And sometimes I think the messaging is we're going to have this completely changed world. Well, actually, it's not. All the evidence I've shown is people actually quite like the technology, irrelevant of what low carbon. Electric car is quieter, cleaner, easier to drive. Insulated homes is going to be warmer, better for air pollution. People like that side of it, even if we put carbon to one side. And I think often for this we talk too much about carbon and not enough about people and the benefits to people. And we need to show them this technology is going to make your life better. Simple as that. And therefore people say, okay, that's fine then. If you go and plug in my car, that's not a big change. We're not going to have whole scale change, We might do it behind the scenes, but the consumer side, when we shouldn't be talking about that, we just say, it's just giving your life a bit better. That's technology, always gets better.
Also, the values point is really key. So my personal anecdote about low traffic neighbourhoods is I live in one. And, you know, admittedly I'm the wrong person for this because, you know, look at me and I work on the environment, so I'm in favour of ours, obviously. However, it's fascinating because I run our street WhatsApp group and we've got split views on cars in general until there was a conversation, someone was talking about the low traffic neighbourhood being a terrible idea, and then just the mums on the street just lost it about air quality in all of the different houses, in the houses where the kind of blokes are like, well, you know, we really like our cars and this is ridiculous. And Mums for Lungs, which is a massive campaign group, are now an incredible pressure group in the borough that I live in. And the shift away from this is about decarbonisation to this is about your children's health and things like school streets and low traffic neighbourhoods in that context has been fairly transformative on the debate, at least in my street WhatsApp group. And I talk about that because I think both from how we think through this in terms of the whole economy challenge, things like using healthcare budgets or thinking about healthcare impacts and thinking about co-benefits and all those things that we're uncomfortable with in traditional fiscal thinking is really, really important. But also for ordinary people, I mean, it's really, Alex said, God, energy is really boring. Yeah, it is. My husband describes me as the most boring woman alive. Like, it's incredibly dull. He's a keeper. But I think for a lot of ordinary people, stuff like the health of your children really matters. And, you know, just as a person, my daughter's 2, on boilers, I scuttled around because I work in this environment, so I know some of the risks, and NOx emissions from transport are very, very terrible for developing fetuses. So when I was pregnant, I used to scuttle around as far away from the road as possible because NOx is a heavy element, and if you can keep away from the roads, you reduce your exposure. Absolutely terrified by it. Was worried about it when I was breastfeeding because it's in breast milk now. Like, these things I know. I have a gas boiler in my house, and it wasn't until about 6 months into her life that I kind of clocked that the gas boiler is a really big source of NOx emissions, and I have been scuttling around on the edge of pavements like a sad crab to keep her away from NOx for her whole life. And there's a gas boiler in my house that is kind of a real problem for and causing the same issue. I talk about that because I think if someone had a conversation with me about replacing my gas boiler for my daughter's health, I would feel differently about it and more motivated by it than if it's a simple conversation about do this for the planet. And I think that's another thing that we should be thinking of in the environmental movement, in the energy sector, but also in government. It's a broader conversation than the one we think it is.
I'm going to open up to the floor now because I imagine there'll be some questions. And you've got the mic. This lady at the front.
I'll stand up so you can see me. Hi, my name is Victoria Matthews and I'm from a company called Valent. We're manufacturers of gas boilers, soon to be hydrogen, and heat pumps. Just want to pick up on one of the comments that Emma made at the beginning. We have recently invested a lot of money to move our heat pump manufacture from Germany and France, and we're moving it into Belper in Derbyshire, which is where our head office is. The topic here is about boosting prosperity, and that's something that we feel that we're doing. But in your opening remarks, Emma, you said that heat pump costs will come down, and I'm just worried about this feeling of heat pump costs changing.
Yeah.
And that puts a lot of pressure on us as a manufacturer. Alexander he made a good comment about China, and I'm just worried about our UK market, and if we put too much focus on manufacturers to reduce costs, we could almost be inviting exports to come into our market. So a bit of an observation and a question there.
I think it's a really good question because it's, again, one of the things we learned from offshore wind, and actually, and this is very frank, but attention in how we design policy, because investing in the UK, so if we invest only on cost and we have a very narrow view of what the benefit to the economy is, often we miss the ability to do things like invest in the supply chain, which can originally cost more money than, you know, relying on other countries and importing, for example. So building supply chains and building jobs here often requires more investment in the beginning, but you get more benefits back in the long run. So I think we've learned that from offshore wind, where the CFD has been absolutely brilliant at driving down costs, and now we're thinking through things like supply chain plans and other mechanisms in the CFD to try and drive up the industrial footprint of that industry in the UK. So I agree with what you're saying. On the heat pump costs, don't forget, it's a small market right now relatively in the UK, so some of that cost reduction will come with scale. And then the other thing is that my understanding is just like with offshore wind, which is why the rollout of heat pumps is more like offshore wind than it is like EVs. A lot of the cost savings we can expect from the installation process, so it's making that process more efficient. I'm expecting some cost reductions from the components, but a lot of it, because it's an established technology in other markets, we're expecting most of that reduction to come from scale and then from, you know, clever ways of installing these products and kind of that learning there. And that's exactly what happened with offshore wind. Yes, big changes in the fleet and the size of the turbines, but also massive improvements about how we build the kit and how we maintain it. And so I'm hoping it's very, very good news for manufacturers in the UK. And on your point, I would encourage government to be thinking about that supply chain manufacturing footprint now as they think about designing the policy to get the mass market away.
Where's the microphone? Oh, there it is. Yeah, this chap.
Hi there, Ed Burkitt from Policy Exchange. I wonder whether you think we talk correctly about what types of technology we're going to be exporting from the UK. So taking the example of offshore wind, it seems less likely we're going to be exporting big things like blades and towers, and more likely we're going to be exporting specialist things like gearboxes,
lawyers,
engineering services, and specialist vessels, for example.
Yeah, I think that's broadly right. I think there is a capability to export large pieces of infrastructure, but the bigger future, when you look at the UK economy as a whole, don't forget, you know, we have a big success as a servicing export economy. We're the world's second largest exporter of services. So I think the bigger part of that future will be in services, but that's not to count out large infrastructure or specialist parts of that. But exporting, you know, as much as we can is ultimately going to be the answer. You know, both. But I think the bigger part of it will be in services.
Yeah. Alex, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I completely agree. We need to the whole way we look at our economy, but it's not just about the technology, it's also like financial models. We're a financial hub in the UK. We need to make sure that we go further and faster when it comes to the green bonds, the green gilts. We need to have that sort of development as well. And yeah, we just need to do and invest in many different technologies and services and start getting them out there and making money for us here in the UK.
I'm only half joking. We have a lot of lawyers, and actually in my previous job working and doing more export-led stuff, I'd say that we spent as much time talking about how you design a CFD with our lawyers and how you do really good site surveys with geoengineers and surveyors and that kind of bit of the industry as we did about big kit. On the big kit point though, we have got some world-leading capacity in the UK, and I really loved Alex's point about you don't have to go necessarily for the jazzy things. It might not be mineral extraction, it might be processing. Similarly, if you think about some of our energy sectors, we might not make blades in the UK at the same level as other countries, but we make cables. We have a brilliant export industry, weirdly, for things like helicopter kit and satellite technology, and you mentioned vessels. The stuff that's tier 1 and tier 2 in the supply chain. So I think we should have a very broad understanding of where the jobs are in this industry. And I think others have said this. That's why it's particularly important not to necessarily label these as green jobs. You know, a lot of those companies service multiple bits of the economy. Their biggest growth market might be green, but they're also servicing things like oil and gas. That's where a lot of the vessels and kind of these other technologies come from. So I think it's important to be imaginative, and again, the lawyers and the bankers are also an exportable commodity for this sector.
Would you like to add?
I'll make just two incredibly quick points. It seems to me implausible over the next 50 years that the future for the UK is in high volume, relatively low skill manufacturing. It's probably going to be much more in smaller, very high skill and specialised and services. So that seems plausible. I think a more general point is to what you were asking is I still think we too often talk about emissions in production rather than consumption terms. And in policy terms, we don't think enough about and haven't done enough on some of the issues, particularly around trade, things like border carbon adjustments that mean that we don't effectively just offshore emissions. I think it has been a challenge in terms of how we talk about our record, and I think it's a policy challenge. And if you're serious about some degree of manufacturing export staying in this country, it's going to have to be addressed.
And also, I keep desperate to plug the retailers in general at the moment, but I'd say one of the really interesting things at the moment in the energy sector is, and as this is a technology panel and thinking about new business models, is the business model piece is also very exportable. So a lot of our energy retailers, where they don't have necessarily the same number of kind of fixed assets in the UK, but they've got a particular business model in retail, are now in other markets, and we're taking that knowledge of the UK system and what we're hoping to do with energy services and energy markets. And, you know, a lot of the retailers are in multiple markets globally, and that's where they're building wealth. And these are, you know, UK-based companies that are in, you know, Texas or South Africa, in, you know, Australia, in other vibrant energy markets globally. So I think we need to have an eye on, you know, digital skills. We need to have an eye on new business models. We need to have an eye on retail and the non component bit of export too, because that will be where a lot of the value is in the future system, is the technologies we've got that make it all join together, and that we are very good at in the UK.
Where's the microphone? This gentleman here.
Hi, Jim Clark from Zurich Insurance. We are looking at ways we can try and create new products and services to support some of these new things, particularly hydrogen production and CCS. As we've got the Minister here, we very much welcome the recent hydrogen strategy, but we really need more data to be able to, because this is all such new stuff, we need more data to be able to support that. So would you be able to commit to sort of sharing some of the data from the pilots, and also perhaps set out any sort of subsidies you might be thinking about in this area as well? That would help us as well.
What sort of data do you mean?
As in quantifiable data on sort of safety and production and everything. anything we could use to sort of help ensure these facilities going forward. So basically, we've got a lot of experience at ensuring refineries, oil and gas, not so much in these new technologies.
Yeah, I see. I think wait for the net zero strategy, which is coming later this month. And why don't we sit down and talk about it after that, yeah? See what's in that first.
To the front.
Brian Tilly from Eon. Minister, there's a huge opportunity for us to back some of the low carbon heating products that we're going to need to deliver net zero. In particular, heat pumps are going to play a major role. And we would urge you to pull all levers to make sure that the likes of Eon can buy heat pumps made in the UK from the likes of Valiant. And that means using the opportunity of the retail energy crisis, as Rachel was saying, to take green levies off the electricity bill and move them to general taxation in the short term, and then think about how we can recover those costs through pricing carbon into fossil fuels in the heating market. But my question more is, can we look at the retail market strategy and ensure that as you develop the future retail market, it's very much aligned with net zero, so we can deliver products that consumers want, and in particular move away from a race to the bottom on cost and move to more service type products which customers really want, so we can provide warmth, hot water, miles and stuff like that, which frankly the current proposals in the strategy around switching are completely against really.
Okay, let me try and deal with some of that. Look, I think the question about green levies, which I've heard from both Emma and from yourself, I think I'm always, as a former Treasury Minister, I'm always conscious of trying to sort of make a policy on the hoof here. I think there's a budget coming up on October the 27th, and I'm sure that the Chancellor of the Exchequer has looked at this issue. I would say just... I hear what you say in terms of the green levies and the cost, but there was, a good basis behind doing that as we did it some years ago now. I think in terms of the messaging on the retail market strategy, look, I'm all ears on that. If Eon wanted to come in and see me, I think I'm sure you will. Why don't we talk a little bit more about that at that time? But making heat pumps cheaper, massive part of the agenda. How do we do it? Driving cost down, messaging, working with the industry, making sure the UK capability, everything we've been talking about so far, our tech and innovation capability builds into that. I think the message about how do we make heat pumps cheaper is something that has been heard quite widely across the industry, and I think industry will respond and react positively is my expectation.
On the retail strategy, just to score cheap lobbying points, it's rare for the energy retailers to agree on everything, but it's not just E.ON. I would say the whole of the retail sector is united in saying that future of retail strategy isn't fit for purpose, and we said that when it was launched, and we said it before it was launched, and have been saying it consistently, and we're seeing what's happening in the retail market, and certainly none of the proposals in that strategy will either deliver net zero or resolve the current situation for customers. And just for, again, the non-energy geeks in the audience, that's because a lot of it focuses on issues from the retail sector from 10 years ago, and the proposals are things like switching and very low cost. Now, low cost is important for vulnerable customers and affordability is important, but if we'd had collective switching right now, a lot of people would be with the suppliers that have gone under, firstly. And secondly, what Brian's describing and what I'm trying to get to inarticulately is a world where your energy retailer is providing you with a heat pump or an EV charger and an interesting flexible tariff that maximises the benefits there, so you're getting cheap energy. That is a much more trusted, enduring relationship, which is about a service and about products than just a commodity. So a retail strategy that focuses on a commodity price and switching people away from suppliers is not going to get you to that world. In fact, it's the opposite. So when we think about decarbonisation, it has to be right from the infrastructure stuff we're talking about through to the technologies in people's homes, but also the services that will really make those sing. And so, yes, we'll be coming to see you about the retail strategy.
Where's the microphone? Oh, that's yeah, this lady.
Hi, Emma Gatton from The Telegraph. Just a question for Emma and for Greg. Do we need to make sure we have more security of supply domestically for gas on the road to full decarbonisation? Where should that come from? I'd also just like to ask Greg if he agrees with Alex's proposition that we need to spend a lot of money on technologies that won't ultimately be winners on this route.
Shall I take that first? I think in terms of security of supply of gas, look, we're very fortunate in this country. 50% of our gas production comes from the UK continental shelf. Additional 30% comes from Norway. Norway have just agreed to increase production and increase exports to the UK since the 1st of October. So we have relatively good, diverse and secure supplies of gas. We're much less dependent. We import very, very little Russian gas, a handful of percentage points at the most. So we've good security of supply. Obviously, we are vulnerable to price and to the global market price, which is what we have seen happened this year, but I'm satisfied with our security of supply at the moment. That is not the issue. The issue is a price-driven issue. I think in terms of technology, my approach would be a portfolio approach, to actually think we should be investing in a series of technologies, some of which will end up being better brought to market than others. And that feeds into both our security and our diversity of supply arguments as well. We need diverse sources of supply, not least because some renewables will not be generating the electricity we need at a particular time. But also I think it makes sense for us not to be over-dependent on one particular source. We need security of supply and that to feed across as well, because renewables are generally domestically produced, and so having that security from a domestic source of supply also adds to our energy security. One thing which was not well noticed last week, a major innovation, was the new electricity subsea cable link to Norway, opened last week by National Grid, which is the world's longest subsea cable. Actually arrives in Blythe as well. So big sort of like a good story for the levelling up agenda as well. But that I think also adds to our security and our diversity of supply questions as well. So all of these things are linked together. But the answer is the UK. I get asked this quite often in the House of Commons. Why are we so dependent on Russian gas? The answer is the UK is not dependent on Russian gas. The UK has got a very good source of domestic supply of gas, which is running down. Admittedly, it's getting less. But most of our gas external supply comes from Norway, which I am confident, how well I know Norway, that Norway will remain very friendly to this country for many, many decades to come.
And I just want to clarify comments about technologies and money. I do believe that we're going to back those technologies. Some, as the Minister said, will come off well and some won't. And of course, there'll be costs involved. But I think overall, there's a far, far, far more financial benefit to gain from backing a range of them and realising the more we back, the more chance we have of these great success stories. So I think there's going to be a massive boon to our economy overall and a massive boon to the exchequer.
So, Emily, two questions. One on the money. So firstly, as I said, the great thing about the UK is because of the R&D we've got and because of the industry we've got and because of the climate scientists we've got, actually you can fairly accurately map what the transition looks like now and the costs involved. And the problem with cost is not an overall one for the economy. It's really clear that actually there's a benefit to people and the economy for doing this. The challenge is where you put the costs up front because it's a capex investment required. One of the reasons I'm really proud of the sector is what the sector is often asking for is set up the market frameworks, because it's industry's job to take some of that risk, and we're good at it. We if the market frameworks are right, the private capital moves in, and again that's what we've seen from offshore wind and moving early. So I think it's give us the market frameworks in which industry can afford to try things and innovate, and sometimes yes fail, but largely we know where we're going and there's a net benefit to the UK economy. Your question about security of supply and the transition. In the short term, and in this particular crisis, I follow the Secretary of State's advice and National Grid's advice is that they're confident in the system through this winter, but they keep it under review, right? So, it's an ever movable feast, the energy system, because, changing weather patterns or changing infrastructure, we just monitor it all the times, but we run a margin for that reason, and we're confident that we're within that through this winter. Looking ahead, again, there's a really clear roadmap to achieving secure supply, affordable energy and a decarbonised energy system. Now that's the really exciting thing, that because the low cost of renewables has happened over the last few years. I don't think, however, we should be complacent about the policy effort required to get there. So the 2035 commitment that we expect the Prime Minister to announce on Wednesday will require some pretty heavy lifting from policy. And as I said, the really big known unknown is how fast we can abate our gas-fired generation, or how much we'll have to use unabated gas generation in the system in the 2030s. And that basically hinges on how fast government brings forward carbon capture, hydrogen, new nuclear, really increases the investment in renewables and things like interconnection and system flexibility. And at the same time is investing with enough scale that we can double or triple the power sector to make sure we're doing heat and transport. So there's a big job to be done to get there. We're confident in getting there with secure supply and affordability for customers. The speed question is about government policy, and I think we can't kind of assume the power sector is done, which we often do, because it's the easy bit relative to heat and transport. There's a lot to be done, which is, again, why we'd quite like an energy bill. But yeah, I feel bullish about it. The industry's job is not just decarbonisation, it is fundamentally about keeping the lights on and providing cheap power for people. And I think the message from industry is we are so up for it on decarbonisation. In fact, we see the value in it, but we won't risk the lights going off. And so, what we want to see from government to make sure we can decarbonise in the 2030s and power is the policy we need to know that we can, do something with the gas fleet.
This gentleman.
The panel were talking quite a lot about let's get it done first, then we can export it, then we can make money out of it. And I get that. What I don't get is the same sort of sense of urgency and enthusiasm for closing down all of the existing ones before the others are stable and ready to go there. And we saw the problems with this recently when we had to fire up one of the old coal-fired stations to balance the system on there, and also about a year ago when the Western Link went down and we had to constrain off all those Scottish wind farms because they couldn't get the power down to where it was needed on that basis, and that was costing us hundreds of millions of pounds to actually do that. And the wind farms, of course, still got paid for the fact that they weren't producing because they were constrained off under the rules of that. Now, we all know that they wouldn't have been built if they hadn't been given that open-ended subsidy, so that they got paid whether they delivered or not. It's great business, isn't it? You get paid, you don't have to deliver it. But so can we ever get just a little bit less enthusiastic about rapidly closing down everything else when it's still actually needed?
No, is the blunt answer. So yes and no. So no, in terms of the security of supply risk, in that the industry's not going to close down assets we need. And actually on coal, the coal phase out is for 2025 with limited hours from 2023. So the coal fleet coming on to provide security supplies is actually exactly the transition working as we wanted it to. We knew we'd probably need coal as renewables scale up. It is expensive when we have to do that, but actually overall the system is still cheaper in where we're going. And when I say renewables are cheap, that includes the policy costs that you're talking to and the cost of balancing the system for renewables. On constraint, it is a madness that we've got brilliant wind resource and we constrain the wind fleet off rather than maximising its use. And what we're talking about in the future energy system we describe is being able to, for example, make green hydrogen when we have a lot of wind power. So you flip the lever and make something useful with it instead of constraining it off, or you utilise it better in the system. And so and I speak for the energy sector, which includes nuclear, gas, coal, renewables. The industry is moving its money into these new technologies, not out of altruism, not because of subsidy or government policy, but actually because you can just see that is a much more valuable energy system where the money is eventually. And we're very, very confident in that market. And that's the point about this being a bit of an industrial revolution. It really has shifted in the last 5 years from being about, well, we're being made to do this for decarbonisation to, oh God, these technologies actually look like they're better than what we've got right now, and that's where the money's going to be. There's going to be we're in the transition. These next 10 years are going to be, as Alex says, a bit of, and Rachel, a bit of trying a bit of everything and making the system work, and a mix of things, and bringing some stuff off and bringing some stuff on. But we are absolutely confident that the future energy system will be the flexible, mostly electrified with some other technologies led one that we're describing, because it's simply cheaper. And for industry, just a better commercial proposition now.
Rachel, would you like to comment on the gentleman's point at all?
No, I think I would agree with both sides of what Emma said. This is not going to be a completely clean, smooth decade. It's not. Partly because there are too many things we don't know, and partly because these are massive delivery and operational challenges at the sort of backbone of the economy. And we do need to ensure security of supply, but I don't know enough about the two specific examples you named to say anything more interesting than that.
I do think we need to think about resilience much more broadly. And by the way, that's not just building additional big kit. It's about making sure that we're managing demand too. So, and that's the point about these two ends of the system needing to be joined up. So if we're going to have a much more flexible technology on one end of the system, we need interconnection and big kit to support it, storage and other technology around it. But we also need consumers to be able to flex their energy demand accordingly and to be able to run the system in that way. And that's why, again, retail is important, but why other technologies that you might not think of as energy technologies, like digital technologies and smart technologies, are going to be really important. So it's a whole new energy world.
And it's also worth mentioning, well, we always talk about net zero. We don't talk about zero carbon. There'll always be carbon in our energy supply, from now until, whenever. And that's why we need technologies like CCUS to offset it, whether it's sort of natural sources. We need to develop that as well, because we're never going to get to zero carbon.
Yeah, there's some really tricky
even
bits
like
to
an electric vehicle, it's full of oil.
Yeah.
An electric vehicle, first fill in the battery to keep it cool. The most effective way of cooling down a battery is with oil. And displacing the heat. We're always going to have carbon, we just to offset it.
And just on, I think Emma's point and yours, the 2035 commitment that looks like the Prime Minister will make on Wednesday aligns with the Committee on Climate Change's 2035 pathway. And in that pathway, they have some unabated gas that sits there for if we have an urgency on the system and will come on for security of supply. Also has some abated gas to do flexibility. So it's a mix of technologies. And again, that's one of the unique, exciting, interesting things about the UK market is we've got a very interesting power sector with lots of big kit on it that we need to support. And we've also got this really innovative demand side with lots of interesting novel technologies and retailers too.
The gentleman over there.
Hi there, thanks. It's a brilliant panel. Edward Robinson from a new campaign called Electrify Heat. And just to echo Emma's points and also Brian's points from me on earlier, I'm very pleased with both new members of this very new campaign, setting out with a single objective to build the market for heat pumps and to bring down the cost of heat pumps. We've got 5 energy companies, we've got other NGOs, we've got the Green Finance Institute. So we're going to really work very hard with your government to really get this ambition of 600,000 heat pumps installed, and then possibly even the CCC's objective million by 2030. So there's a lot of work to do. We do know that costs have to come down, but we're absolutely confident they can, on the message, I mean, you need to echo the points made on levies, etc. It's just unfair as it is. It would be an important messaging thing, if not an economic thing, to do that. But there's a really strong message on jobs as well, and things like the cost will come down, of course, in technology, but also we just need more installers and trained people that people can trust, etc. And at the moment, it's fair to say there simply aren't many people in Britain that actually know how to install a heat pump. And if you're going to get to 600k, you're going to need absolutely thousands of people to start being trained right now to understand the technology, how it goes in, etc., and then be sort of certified, etc., etc. That'd be a really strong message that government can take to the country right now. So you're setting up an agency, getting those people trained. You can be absolutely confident, Minister, that the companies around doing this are going to work really, really, really hard to get that heat pump cost right down. And it's great to hear the Valence story that they're onshoring production. So, a really good story all round, and absolutely convinced that it can happen.
Can I ask you, is the answer partly to retrain the existing workforce who are doing boilers and basically get them to double up in a crude layman's terms, or is it? Do we need plus presumably people?
I mean, anyone that can install a gas boiler and has the skills to do that will be able to take those skills and repurpose them or do both. And we're not saying no to hydrogen boilers, etc. But we are saying you've got a straight up win. But you need the certification, and I think it's fair to say that there's got to be real trust with people, because that we're pushing a technology which is, although it's very well known in large parts of continental Europe and some of the coldest parts of Europe, it's less well known here, and so you need that real trust with the installers. People, I think, take a lot of advice from their installers on when they want to replacing a gas boiler. It's like 1.5 million boilers replaced every year or something. I can't remember the exact number. But they usually take their advice from the installer that comes in and says, you'll need this. So they'll need to have total certainty that their installer says, can do a heat pump, can do it properly, can do it effectively cheaply, and then we're going to get up to that installation target. So that's really important. And I think repurposing and retraining, as well as just new people coming in. And a lot of people are trained from apprentices, etc. So you've got people right at the beginning of their careers.
I think it's worth noting, and we clearly, one thing I've noticed in a lot of energy panels across conferences, a lot of heat pump people out there desperately trying to push heat pumps. And I'm a big fan of heat pumps. However, we've got to be realistic. There's 30 million homes in the country. You said 1.5 million boilers are being replaced each year. We're going to go a long time to get heat pumps in everyone's homes. So I think we also need to make sure we don't crowd out other solutions, maybe interim solutions, such as putting maybe 20% hydrogen in the pipes in the meantime. So we can't just make everything on heat pumps. We have to look at a myriad of
we're
solutions.
cross-technology at EnergyUK, and so actually we do support a mix of technologies for decarbonising heat. The reason we focus on electrification is from a system point of view. That's going to be where the most value is, for the reason that what's happening on the supply side offers the potential to run a kind of flexible system where you get electrons from kind of start to finish to consumers, and there's all those energy services too. I think there's really good potential for hydrogen and for things like energy to waste and heat networks in different applications. So in cities where you've got terrace houses, heat networks, and maybe a giant heat pump on the end or some other form of production. If you're in an industrial cluster, naturally you can see an application for hydrogen there. I think what we've got to be careful with hydrogen is that unless we can get a much higher blend through the gas grid, it's not net zero compatible. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is about production volume. So it's a very, very valuable commodity. For the reason you described, there are some things we cannot do with electrons and electrification, and hydrogen will be very, very useful for those sectors. And so if we use it for heat, we have less of it for there. And to generate enough green and net zero compatible hydrogen to do heat as well as everything else, it gets very, very challenging. So I think because it's an interesting, valuable commodity, we need to use it where it's most appropriate. That said, I recognise some of the challenges with the heat pumps. Can I just say on skills, there are two routes to market for heat pumps, so there will be, which I think is the fascinating thing. One is your traditional installer route, and I had conversations with a plumber about a heat pump. That was fun. It's like 3 weeks of my life I'm never getting back, and have a gas boiler. And I think that installer, retraining installers and that traditional installer route is really important, and a huge potential for jobs there, and it probably will be, reskilling. Manufacturers will work with that industry to do some of that. We're going to need to make sure certification and standards are right, so that people are not out of pocket for having to retrain, and think that through very carefully. However, the other thing I'd say is an advantage of doing things like swapping the levies so the retailers can develop a market proposition as they will then do the training. We're already seeing the retailers investing in training centres for bringing on installers. And if you want to imagine the model, you know, everyone knows that that British Gas and many of the other energy retailers have big boiler installer and energy services arms. You're familiar with that as a model. That is exactly what we're talking about for heat pumps, and why it's important to try and give the retail sector the chance to try and develop that, because they'll invest in the skilling.
We've got. We're just coming to the end now, but I can see that. Did you want to respond to that? I'm sorry that I haven't got around to all the questions. There's, you know, we could keep going for hours. Really, this conversation is so interesting, and there's so much to say about it. But I'm sure afterwards, if you want to keep chatting about these matters, I'd like to thank our panellists for their insights today. It's been a great discussion. I'd like to thank our partner, EnergyUK, and I'd like to thank you, the audience, for your time. So have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you.